The corporate attorney towered over her desk, his voice dripping with contempt as he slammed the file down. "Listen carefully, clerk. In this firm, you do exactly what I say when I say it. No questions, no opinions, just obedience." Irene Hill looked up slowly, her pale green eyes meeting his without a flicker of fear. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because beneath her crisp white blouse, hidden under professional blazers and polite smiles, was a truth that would shatter every assumption this man had ever made about power. The silver ring on her right hand caught the fluorescent light for just a moment, a simple band that most people never noticed. But for those who knew, that ring told a story that no amount of legal intimidation could ever match. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The law offices of Hartwell and Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Frankfurt, where the Rhine River curved through the city like a silver question mark. Irene Hill had arrived at 7:30 that Monday morning, 2 hours before the rest of the clerical staff, not because she was eager, but because old habits died hard. In another life, she'd been awake at 0400 hours, running tactical drills before most people had their first coffee. Now she was a file clerk in a law firm, and the most dangerous thing she faced was paper cuts and passive aggression. She arranged her desk with military precision pens aligned, files organized by priority, coffee positioned exactly 3 inches from her keyboard. The ritual calmed something restless inside her, something that still woke her at dawn with the phantom weight of body armor pressing against her chest. 6 months had passed since she'd left the service, since she'd traded combat boots for sensible heels and classified operations for document filing. The transition hadn't been easy. Irene was 28, though most people assumed she was younger. Her face had a softness that belied the steel underneath high cheekbones inherited from her Polish grandmother, pale skin that flushed easily when she was angry, and blonde hair that she kept pulled back in a neat bun. She stood barely 5'6", with a slender frame that looked fragile until you noticed the way she moved, with an economy of motion that spoke of training most people couldn't imagine. The ring on her right hand was the only outward sign of who she'd been. Sterling silver, engraved with symbols that meant nothing to civilians, but everything to those who'd earned the right to wear it. She'd thought about taking it off when she started this job, about leaving that part of her life completely behind. But the ring stayed. It was a reminder of what she was capable of, even if no one here would ever know. "Morning, Irene," called Petra, one of the other clerks, breezing past with a stack of folders. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Fair warning though, Donnelly's already in a mood. Apparently, the Kemper brief wasn't filed correctly on Friday, and he's on the warpath. Irene's jaw tightened slightly. Lawrence Donnelly was a senior partner, a man who treated support staff like interchangeable furniture. She'd dealt with his type before, though in her previous career, men like Donnelly usually learned quickly that rank didn't entitle you to cruelty. Here in the civilian world, the rules were different. Here, people like Donnelly thrived. "Thanks for the heads up," Irene said, her accent carrying traces of her German childhood softened by years of international deployment. She'd been born in Stuttgart but raised in half a dozen countries, as her father's engineering career moved the family around Europe. By the time she was 18, she spoke 4 languages fluently and had developed a chameleon's ability to adapt to any environment. That skill had served her well in special operations. It served her less well in corporate law, where adaptation often meant swallowing your pride and accepting disrespect with a smile. The morning proceeded with its usual rhythm. Files were retrieved. Documents were copied. Phones were answered with professional courtesy. Irene moved through her tasks with quiet efficiency, the kind that made her invisible to the attorneys who swept past her desk without acknowledgement. She'd learned in her first week that being invisible was safer. The less you were noticed, the less you were targeted. But at 10:47, her invisibility ended. Lawrence Donnelly emerged from his office like a storm given human form. He was a large man, 6'3", and broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair and a face that had settled into permanent dissatisfaction. His reputation in the firm was legendary, brilliant in the courtroom, brutal everywhere else. Associates feared him. Partners deferred to him. And support staff simply tried to stay out of his way. Today, apparently, Irene was directly in his way. "You," he said, stopping at her desk with a manila folder clutched in one meaty hand. "You're the new clerk. Hill, isn't it?" "Yes, Mr. Donnelly," Irene replied, looking up from her computer screen. "How can I help you?" "You can help me by explaining why the Kemper documents weren't cross-referenced correctly." He dropped the folder on her desk with enough force to scatter her carefully arranged pens. "I spent an hour this morning fixing mistakes that should never have been made in the first place." Irene glanced at the folder, recognizing immediately that she hadn't worked on the Kemper case. That had been Stefan, one of the other clerks, who'd left early on Friday claiming a family emergency. But before she could explain this, Donnelly continued, his voice rising enough to draw attention from nearby cubicles. "I don't know how things worked wherever you came from, but at this firm we have standards. When I ask for something to be done correctly, I expect it to be done correctly the first time. Do you understand me?" The office had gone quiet. Irene could feel eyes on her, could sense the familiar dynamic of a predator establishing dominance over prey. In her old life, she would have responded differently. In her old life, men who spoke to her like this learned very quickly that volume didn't equal authority. But this wasn't her old life, and the rules here were different. "Mr. Donnelly," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. "I didn't work on the Kemper file. That was—" "I don't care whose name was on it," Donnelly interrupted. "You're part of the clerical team, which means you're responsible for making sure work gets done properly. If someone else made mistakes, you should have caught them. That's called quality control." Irene felt her hands curl into fists beneath her desk, an instinctive response to confrontation that she forced herself to suppress. The man was wrong both factually and ethically, but arguing would only escalate the situation. She'd seen enough power plays to recognize one in action. Donnelly wasn't interested in accuracy or fairness. He was interested in reminding everyone in the office of his position in the hierarchy. "I understand," she said quietly, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "I'll make sure to review all clerical work going forward." Donnelly leaned forward, placing both hands on her desk in a gesture clearly designed to intimidate. Up close, she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with coffee breath. His eyes were small and mean, the eyes of someone who'd learned that bullying was effective and had never been forced to unlearn it. "Let me make something very clear to you, Miss Hill," he said, his voice dropping to a tone that somehow managed to be both quieter and more threatening. "In this firm, you do exactly what I say when I say it. No questions, no opinions, just obedience. If I tell you to file something, you file it. If I tell you to stay late, you stay late. If I tell you to reorganize an entire filing room, you smile and ask how quickly I need it done. Do we have an understanding?" The office remained silent. Somewhere behind her, Irene heard Petra shift uncomfortably in her chair. She was aware of Thomas, one of the junior associates, watching from his office doorway with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been relief that he wasn't the target. The moment stretched, crystallizing into something that felt significant in a way Irene couldn't quite name. She looked up at Donnelly, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that seemed to surprise him slightly. For just a second, she let herself imagine responding the way she wanted to, explaining exactly what would happen if he ever invaded her personal space like this again, demonstrating the 17 different ways she could remove his hands from her desk. None of them pleasant. But she didn't. Because this wasn't a battlefield, and violence wasn't an option, and she needed this job. Because civilian life required paychecks and health insurance, and all the mundane necessities that military service had once provided. "Yes, Mr. Donnelly," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "We have an understanding." He stared at her for another moment, as if trying to detect any hint of defiance, then straightened with a satisfied grunt. "Good. I need the Morrison files pulled and on my desk by noon. All of them. And this time, make sure they're properly organized. He turned and walked back toward his office, leaving the folder scattered across Irene's desk like debris from an explosion. The normal sounds of the office gradually resumed: keyboards clicking, phones ringing, hushed conversations. But Irene remained still, her hands still curled into fists, her breathing carefully controlled. The ring on her right hand caught the light again, its surface worn smooth by years of wear. She uncurled her fingers slowly and looked at it, really looked at it for the first time in weeks. The engraving was simple, just a series of symbols that represented a world Donnelly couldn't imagine. A world where respect was earned through competence and courage, not demanded through intimidation. A world where people like her had proven themselves against challenges that would break men like Lawrence Donnelly in half. Petra appeared at her desk a few minutes later, her expression a mixture of anger and sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Irene. Donnelly's always been a nightmare, but that was over the line. You should report him to HR." Irene shook her head slightly, already gathering the files she'd need for the Morrison case. "It's fine. I can handle it." "But it's not fine," Petra insisted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He treats support staff like dirt, and no one ever calls him on it because he brings in too much money for the firm. Someone needs to stand up to him." "Maybe," Irene said quietly. "But not today." As Petra walked away, Irene began the methodical process of pulling the Morrison files. Her hands moved efficiently, but her mind was elsewhere, caught between who she used to be and who she was trying to become. The problem with transformation, she was learning, was that you could change your circumstances but not your nature. And her nature, forged through years of the most demanding training imaginable, didn't respond well to bullies. She just needed to decide what she was going to do about it. The Morrison files filled 2 large boxes and represented 6 months of complex litigation over pharmaceutical patents. Irene carried them to Donnelly's office at 11:45, 15 minutes ahead of his noon deadline. She'd learned early in her military career that being early was a form of armor. It eliminated one avenue of criticism and often caught people off guard. She knocked twice on the mahogany doorframe, waiting for acknowledgement before entering. Donnelly barely looked up from his computer screen. "Put them there," he said, gesturing vaguely toward a table already covered with legal briefs and case files. "And next time, I shouldn't have to ask twice for files. I expect you to anticipate what I need before I need it." Irene set the boxes down carefully, noting the impossibility of his expectation. Anticipating someone's needs required either telepathy or sufficient observation time to establish patterns. She'd been at the firm for exactly 3 weeks. But pointing this out would be futile, so she simply nodded and turned to leave. "One more thing," Donnelly called out as she reached the doorway. "I'm expecting a call from the Stuttgart office this afternoon. When it comes through, I don't care what you're doing. You transfer it to me immediately. Understood?" "Understood," Irene replied, though she noted with satisfaction that the Stuttgart reference meant she'd likely be better positioned than Donnelly to handle whatever the German office needed. Her fluency in German was something she'd mentioned during her interview but had rarely needed in the job so far. Back at her desk, Irene tried to settle into the afternoon routine, but her concentration was fractured. The confrontation with Donnelly had shaken something loose inside her, a restlessness that she'd thought she'd successfully contained. For 6 months, she'd told herself that leaving the service was the right choice, that she needed a normal life after years of deployments that couldn't be discussed and operations that officially never happened. But normal was turning out to be harder than she'd anticipated. The Delta Force ring on her finger felt heavier than usual. She'd earned it through a selection process that had broken stronger and larger candidates. Women in special operations faced scrutiny that their male counterparts never experienced, every mistake magnified, every success minimized, every moment a test of whether you deserved to be there. Irene had not just passed those tests. She'd excelled. She'd completed operations in 17 countries, had languages and cultural expertise that made her invaluable for certain missions, and had proven herself under conditions that Donnelly couldn't conceive of. And now she was fetching his files and absorbing his insults. "Irene?" Thomas approached her desk, the junior associate who'd watched Donnelly's earlier performance. He was young, maybe 26, with the earnest expression of someone who still believed law could be about justice rather than billable hours. "I just wanted to say that what Donnelly did this morning was completely unprofessional. If you want to file a complaint, I'd be happy to support you." "I appreciate that," Irene said, offering him a small smile. "But it's really fine. I've dealt with difficult personalities before." "I'm sure you have." But Thomas paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Look, I know you're new, so maybe you don't realize how toxic this place can be. Donnelly's behavior is legendary, and not in a good way. Last year, he made an associate cry during a meeting. The year before that, a paralegal quit on the spot after he screamed at her for 20 minutes over a typo. The firm protects him because he's a rainmaker, but that doesn't make it right." Irene felt a flicker of warmth toward Thomas. In a firm full of people who'd watched Donnelly's display and said nothing, at least one person was willing to acknowledge the wrong. "What happened to the paralegal?" she asked. "She filed a complaint with HR, but nothing came of it. They gave her a settlement in exchange for an NDA, and she left quietly. That's how they handle everything here, money and silence." Thomas leaned against her desk, lowering his voice. "Between you and me, I'm only staying long enough to pay off my student loans. Then I'm finding a firm that actually values human decency." "How much longer?" Irene asked, curious. 3 more years, Thomas said with a grimace. "You?" "One day at a time," Irene replied, which was both true and insufficient. The reality was she had no long-term plan. The military had been her identity for nearly a decade, and without it, she was adrift in a world whose rules she didn't fully understand. The afternoon crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Irene processed intake forms, filed correspondence, and answered phones with mechanical efficiency. At 3:17, the call from Stuttgart came through. She answered in German, her accent immediately shifting to match the regional dialect of the caller. "Good afternoon. This is Hartwell and Associates, Irene speaking." "Ah, wonderful." The voice on the other end sounded relieved. "Finally, someone who speaks proper German. I've been trying to reach Mr. Donnelly, but his secretary keeps putting me on hold. This is Klaus Hoffmann from the Stuttgart office. I need to discuss the Bauer merger documents, but there are some technical terms in the English version that we need clarified." "One moment, please. I'll transfer you to Mr. Donnelly," Irene said, already reaching for the transfer button. "Actually," Klaus interrupted, "if you speak German this well, perhaps you could help me directly. These are relatively simple questions about document formatting and specific clause interpretations. It would save considerable time if you could answer them now rather than going through multiple transfers." Irene hesitated. On one hand, Donnelly had explicitly instructed her to transfer the call immediately. On the other hand, she was perfectly capable of handling Klaus's questions, probably more capable than Donnelly, whose German was functional but far from fluent. Helping directly would be more efficient for everyone involved. "Let me get Mr. Donnelly's authorization first," she said carefully. "Please hold." She transferred the call to Donnelly's line, then picked up her desk phone to explain the situation. "Mr. Donnelly, I have Klaus Hoffmann from Stuttgart on line 3. He has technical questions about document formatting. I speak fluent German and could handle his questions if you'd like, or I can transfer him directly to you." There was a pause, during which Irene could almost hear Donnelly's calculations. Admitting he needed her language skills would undermine the dominance he'd established that morning, but taking the call himself would be time-consuming and difficult given his limited German. "What kind of technical questions?" he finally asked. "Formatting and clause interpretation." He said they're relatively straightforward. Another pause. "Fine. Handle it. But document everything and send me a summary afterward." "Of course," Irene said, switching back to the call with Klaus. For the next 20 minutes, she worked through his questions with easy competence. Her military experience with document security protocols actually proving useful in the corporate context. Klaus was grateful and efficient, and by the end of the call, he'd requested her direct line for future questions. Irene documented the conversation in a detailed email to Donnelly, carbon copying Thomas as a witness to the interaction. She was about to return to her regular work when Donnelly's door opened, and he emerged with an expression that managed to be both pleased and irritated. "Hill," he called out, crossing to her desk. "The Stuttgart call. You handled it adequately." "Thank you," Irene said, recognizing that from Donnelly, adequately was probably generous praise. "However," he continued, and there it was, the inevitable criticism. "In the future, I expect you to loop me into these conversations. I don't like being cut out of communications with our international offices." Irene bit back her initial response, which would have pointed out that she'd specifically asked his permission before handling the call. Instead, she nodded. "Understood. Would you like me to conference you in on future calls? Or would you prefer written summaries?" The question seemed to catch Donnelly off guard, as if he hadn't expected her to seek clarification rather than simply accept the criticism. "Written summaries are fine," he said after a moment. "But detailed ones. I need to know exactly what's being discussed." "Of course." Donnelly lingered at her desk, and Irene recognized the behavior from her military experience. He was a person who needed to maintain control of every interaction, who couldn't simply accept competence without asserting his authority over it. She waited, her expression neutral, until he finally turned and walked back to his office. Petra appeared moments later, rolling her eyes. "He actually complimented you? That might be a first. Maybe he's finally realizing that treating staff like humans gets better results." "I doubt it," Irene said quietly. "People like Donnelly don't change. They just adjust their tactics. You sound like you've dealt with men like him before." "You could say that. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated." Now, let's return to the narrative. The rest of the week passed in an uneasy truce. Donnelly continued to bark orders and make unreasonable demands, but he'd stopped singling Irene out for public humiliation. She suspected this had less to do with respect and more to do with the fact that she'd proven useful with the Stuttgart office. 3 more calls had come through, each one handled efficiently in German, and Klaus Hoffmann had specifically requested her assistance on an upcoming merger that would require extensive translation work. Irene should have felt satisfaction at this small victory, but instead she felt hollow. Each day at the firm was like wearing a costume that didn't quite fit the professional clothes, the deferential attitude, the careful dance of office politics. She found herself missing the clarity of her previous life, where objectives were defined and success was measurable. Here, success seemed to mean not getting yelled at, which felt like an absurdly low bar. On Friday afternoon, as she was preparing to leave, Thomas stopped by her desk with an invitation. "Some of us are going to Werner's Biergarten after work. You should come. It's not fancy, just a chance to decompress away from this place." Irene hesitated. She'd kept herself separate from the office social scene deliberately, unwilling to form connections that might require explanations about her past. But Thomas's expression was hopeful, and she realized that isolation, while safe, was also exhausting. "All right," she said. "I'll come for one drink." Werner's Biergarten was exactly what it sounded like, a traditional German beer garden with long wooden tables, strings of lights overhead, and the smell of grilled bratwurst in the air. Thomas was there with Petra and 3 other support staff members, all of them visibly more relaxed away from the office. They welcomed Irene warmly, sliding over to make room at their table. "To surviving another week at Hartwell," Petra announced, raising her beer glass. The others echoed the toast, and Irene found herself genuinely smiling for the first time in days. The conversation flowed easily: complaints about difficult attorneys, gossip about office politics, speculation about upcoming promotions. Irene contributed little, content to listen and observe. But when the discussion turned to Donnelly, she found herself paying closer attention. "He's getting worse," said Anna, one of the paralegals. Yesterday, he threw a stapler across his office because a brief wasn't formatted exactly how he wanted. A stapler. Like a toddler having a tantrum. Someone needs to stand up to him, Thomas said, his third beer making him bold. The problem is everyone's too scared of losing their jobs. It's not just fear, Petra countered. It's reality. The firm protects him because he brings in millions in revenue. They don't care how many staff members he chews through as long as the money keeps flowing. There has to be a breaking point though, Anna argued. Eventually, he's going to cross a line that even the firm can't ignore. Irene turned her beer glass slowly in her hands, feeling the cool condensation against her fingers. She'd seen this pattern before in military units, toxic leaders who were protected because they delivered results, creating environments where people suffered in silence or left. The difference was that the military had accountability structures, however imperfect. Corporate law seemed to have none. What about you, Irene? Thomas asked suddenly. You've been quiet. What do you think we should do about Donnelly? 5 pairs of eyes turned toward her expectantly. Irene considered her words carefully. I think, she said slowly, that bullies rely on people being too intimidated to challenge them. They create fear deliberately, because fear gives them power. The moment someone refuses to be intimidated, the dynamic changes. Easier said than done, Petra replied, especially when your paycheck depends on not making waves. True, Irene acknowledged. But sometimes the cost of not making waves is higher than the cost of making them. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but Irene's words lingered in her own mind. She'd spoken a truth. She was only beginning to understand that her discomfort at the firm wasn't just about Donnelly's behavior, but about her own unwillingness to confront it. She'd spent years in an environment where she'd fought for every ounce of respect, where backing down meant failure. And now she was backing down daily, swallowing insults, accepting treatment she'd never have tolerated in uniform. The ring on her finger caught the light from the strings overhead, and she found herself twisting it absently. What was the point of having been Delta Force if she couldn't even stand up to a corporate bully? Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that made Frankfurt look particularly industrial. Irene arrived at the office at her usual early hour, but this time she felt different, more alert, more present. The weekend had given her time to think, and she'd reached a decision. She wasn't going to quit her job, but she also wasn't going to keep absorbing abuse silently. There had to be a middle path, a way to maintain her professionalism while refusing to be diminished. The opportunity to test this resolve came sooner than expected. At 9:15, Donnelly stormed out of his office, holding a stack of files that Irene recognized immediately, the pharmaceutical merger documents she'd spent all of Friday afternoon organizing. His face was flushed with anger, and his voice carried across the entire floor. Hill, get in here, now. Irene stood calmly and walked to his office, aware of the sudden silence that had fallen over the clerical area. Donnelly was standing behind his desk, the files spread out before him like evidence at a crime scene. Explain this, he demanded, jabbing a finger at the documents. These were supposed to be organized chronologically. Instead, they're organized by what exactly? Because I certainly can't figure out your system. Irene stepped closer and examined the files. They were organized exactly as she'd left them, chronologically within categorical sections, which was the standard protocol for complex mergers. They are chronological, Mr. Donnelly. But they're first divided by category: financial documents, legal filings, correspondence, and technical specifications. Within each category, everything is chronological. This is the standard organizational method for merger documentation. I don't care about standard methods, Donnelly snapped. I care about what I asked for, which was simple chronological order. One date after another, regardless of document type. Is that somehow too complicated for you to understand? Irene felt her jaw tighten. That method would make it significantly more difficult to locate specific types of documents. If you need to find all financial statements from a particular period, you'd have to search through. I didn't ask for your opinion on document organization, Donnelly interrupted, his voice rising. I asked you to do a simple task, and you decided you knew better. This is exactly the problem with you. You think you're smarter than everyone else." The accusation hung in the air, absurd in its projection. Irene had spent 3 hours on Friday organizing those files specifically to make Donnelly's work easier. She'd applied professional standards and considerable care. And now, she was being berated for competence. Something inside her shifted. "Mr. Donnelly," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying an edge she hadn't used since leaving the service. "I organized those files according to industry best practices, which I researched specifically to ensure I did the job correctly. If you have a different preference, I'm happy to reorganize them. But I won't accept being accused of incompetence when I've done the work properly." Donnelly's eyes widened slightly, clearly unaccustomed to pushback. "Excuse me? You heard me." Irene met his gaze steadily. "I respect your position, and I'll follow your instructions. But I also expect basic professional courtesy in return. Yelling and insults aren't instructions, they're just noise." The office beyond Donnelly's door had gone completely silent. Irene was aware that this conversation was probably being heard by half the floor, that she was crossing a line that could cost her everything. But she was also aware that she'd crossed bigger lines in darker places, and this corporate intimidation suddenly seemed almost laughable in comparison. Donnelly's face had progressed from flushed to deep red. "How dare you speak to me that way? I'm a senior partner at this firm, and you're a file clerk. A replaceable file clerk. Then replace me," Irene said calmly. "But until you do, treat me with the same respect you'd expect from me. That's not negotiable." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the tension crackling like electricity. Irene could see Donnelly calculating, trying to reassert control over a situation that had somehow slipped away from him. She recognized the look she'd seen it on the faces of insurgents who'd underestimated her capabilities, on the faces of training instructors who'd assumed her size meant weakness. "Get out of my office," Donnelly finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And don't come back until you've reorganized those files, exactly how I specified. I want them on my desk by noon. Or you can clean out your desk permanently." Irene gathered the files without another word and returned to her desk. Her hands were steady, but her heart was racing with the familiar rush of adrenaline that came from confrontation. Around her, colleagues pretended to work while obviously straining to hear what would happen next. Petra looked terrified, Thomas impressed, and Anna somewhere between shocked and admiring. Reorganizing the files took 90 minutes of tedious work, undoing careful categorization to create the simpler but less functional chronological sequence Donnelly had demanded. Irene worked methodically, using the repetitive task to calm her nervous system and think through the implications of what she'd done. Standing up to Donnelly felt right necessary. But it also felt reckless. She needed this job, needed the stability and normalcy it represented. Losing it over a confrontation with a bully seemed like a stupid way to end her civilian career attempt. But the alternative, continuing to accept abuse, seemed worse. At 11:45, she delivered the reorganized files to Donnelly's office. He took them without comment, examining the new organization with an expression that suggested he was disappointed not to find another error to criticize. Irene waited silently until he finally looked up. "Acceptable," he said curtly. "You're dismissed." Irene nodded and turned to leave, but Donnelly's voice stopped her at the door. "Hill, one more thing." She turned back, bracing herself for whatever would come next. "Your little outburst this morning," Donnelly said, leaning back in his chair with forced casualness. "I'm willing to overlook it this time. We all have bad days. But if you ever speak to me that way again, you'll be out of this firm so fast your head will spin. Am I clear?" "Perfectly clear," Irene replied. She didn't apologize, didn't thank him for his supposed mercy. She simply acknowledged his statement and left. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Irene processed her normal workload, but she was hyper-aware of the changed atmosphere around her. Some colleagues seemed to regard her with new respect. Others kept their distance, as if confrontation with Donnelly might be contagious. Thomas gave her a discreet thumbs up from across the room. Petra looked worried but said nothing. At 4:30, just as Irene was preparing to leave for the day, she received an email from HR requesting a meeting first thing Tuesday morning. Her stomach dropped. This was the consequence of standing up for herself. Donnelly had clearly filed a complaint, and now she'd be formally reprimanded or possibly fired. That evening, back in her small apartment in Sachsenhausen, Irene sat by the window watching the main river flow past, dark and steady. Her apartment was sparse furniture from IKEA, walls mostly bare, nothing that spoke of permanence or personality. She'd told herself it was temporary, that she'd decorate once she felt more settled. But 6 months had passed, and the walls remained empty, as if some part of her knew she didn't really belong in this life. She looked down at the Delta Force ring on her finger, really examined it for the first time in weeks. The silver was worn smooth in places where it had rubbed against weapons, climbing gear, and countless other pieces of equipment. The symbols etched into its surface represented a community she no longer belonged to, a version of herself she'd left behind. Or had she? The woman who'd confronted Donnelly that morning that had been the real Irene Hill. Not the diminished version who'd spent 3 weeks being invisible. The problem was that the real Irene Hill didn't fit well into corporate law. She was too direct, too unwilling to accept artificial hierarchies, too accustomed to environments where competence mattered more than politics. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you did the right thing. Some of us have been waiting for someone to stand up to him." Irene smiled slightly at that. Maybe her confrontation would matter beyond just her own situation. Maybe watching someone refuse to be intimidated would embolden others to do the same. Or maybe she'd just be a cautionary tale, the clerk who talked back and paid the price. Either way, she wasn't going to apologize. The HR office was located on the 2nd floor, a space designed to seem welcoming despite its role as the firm's disciplinary arm. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, motivational posters about teamwork, all of it carefully calculated to put people at ease while their careers were being evaluated. Irene sat in the waiting area at precisely 8 a.m., her posture military straight, her expression calm. Helga Fischer, the HR director, emerged at 8:07. She was a woman in her mid-50s, with sharp eyes and an air of professional neutrality that Irene recognized as carefully cultivated. "Miss Hill, thank you for coming. Please, follow me." The office was exactly what Irene expected: orderly, impersonal, with a desk positioned to create psychological distance between Fisher and whoever sat across from her. A file folder lay on the desk, presumably containing Irene's employment records and whatever complaint Donnelly had filed. "I'll get straight to the point," Fisher began, settling into her chair. "We've received a complaint from Mr. Donnelly regarding your conduct yesterday morning. He's described the interaction as insubordinate and disrespectful. I'd like to hear your version of events." Irene had prepared for this conversation, had mentally rehearsed her response to avoid either defensiveness or excessive detail. "Mr. Donnelly asked me to reorganize files. I'd organized them according to industry standard practices for complex merger documentation. When he criticized my work, I explained my reasoning and requested that future instructions be provided with more specificity. I also asked that he speak to me with professional courtesy." Fisher's expression didn't change, but she made a note on the legal pad before her. "Mr. Donnelly characterizes your response as confrontational. He says you refused to follow instructions and challenged his authority." "I reorganized the files exactly as he specified," Irene replied. "They were delivered to his office ahead of his deadline. As for challenging his authority, I asked to be treated with respect. I don't consider that a challenge. The workplace has hierarchies for a reason, Miss Hill. Support staff are expected to accept direction from attorneys without argument." "I accept direction," Irene said carefully. "What I don't accept is being yelled at, insulted, or accused of incompetence when I've done my job correctly. There's a difference between authority and abuse." Fisher studied her for a long moment, and Irene had the distinct impression she was being evaluated for something beyond this specific incident. You've been with us for 3 weeks. Your work has been exemplary, technically proficient, detail-oriented, and you've received positive feedback from the Stuttgart office. But you've also been described as intense, overly serious, and difficult to read. I focus on doing my job well, Irene said. If that comes across as intense, I'm not sure what to apologize for. I'm not asking you to apologize. Fisher leaned back in her chair. I'm trying to understand whether you're a good fit for this environment. Law firms can be demanding, high-pressure places. Attorneys like Mr. Donnelly set high standards and expect support staff to meet those standards without complaint. Irene felt her temper beginning to rise, but kept her voice level. With respect, Miss Fisher, there's a difference between high standards and verbal abuse. I've worked in demanding environments before, environments where people's lives depended on precision and performance. I understand pressure. What I don't understand is why I should accept being treated as less than human because someone has a title. The words hung in the air between them. Fisher's expression shifted slightly, not quite sympathy, but something close to understanding. She glanced down at the file, then back up at Irene. Where did you work before joining us? Your resume lists general administrative experience but isn't very specific about your background. This was dangerous territory. Irene's military service was deliberately vague on her civilian resume, described only as government administrative work. The details of her actual career, the deployments, the operations, the specialized training were classified or sensitive enough that she couldn't discuss them even if she wanted to. I worked for the government, Irene said carefully, in positions that required discretion and attention to detail. That's remarkably vague. Some positions require vagueness. Fisher studied her with renewed interest, and Irene realized she might have said too much. The HR director was clearly intelligent enough to read between the lines, to recognize that someone with Irene's bearing and careful word choices had a background more interesting than general administrative work. Miss Hill, Fisher said after a moment, I'm going to be frank with you. Mr. Donnelly is a difficult person to work with. He's brilliant in the courtroom, valuable to the firm, and absolutely toxic to support staff. In the past 3 years, 7 clerks and paralegals have either quit or requested transfers specifically because of him. The firm tolerates this because he generates significant revenue. That's the reality of corporate law. So I should just accept it? Irene asked. I'm not saying you should accept it. I'm saying you need to decide whether working here is worth the cost. Fisher paused. That said, standing up to Donnelly, actually pushing back on his behavior, that's something I haven't seen before. Most people either quit or endure in silence. And which would you prefer I do? Fisher smiled slightly. Personally, I'd prefer you stay and keep pushing back. But that's not an official HR position. Officially, I'm required to document this incident and remind you that insubordination is grounds for termination. Understood. Unofficially, Fisher continued, lowering her voice slightly, I think someone like you, someone with a backbone, and the skills to back it up, might be exactly what this firm needs, even if they don't realize it yet. The meeting with Fisher ended with a formal warning placed in Irene's file and an informal acknowledgement that sometimes standing your ground was worth the risk. Irene left the HR office feeling oddly vindicated, though she understood the precariousness of her position. She'd been granted a reprieve, not absolution, and Donnelly wouldn't forget or forgive her challenge to his authority. The following 2 weeks proved her instincts correct. Donnelly's campaign against her was subtle but relentless assignments with impossible deadlines, criticism of work that was objectively flawless, public comments designed to undermine her credibility. He never quite crossed the line into actionable harassment, but he made sure Irene understood that her defiance would be punished incrementally. I need the Schneider contracts, translated by tomorrow morning, he announced one afternoon, dropping a stack of documents on her desk. All 47 pages. I assume your German is actually as good as you claim? Irene looked at the contracts, quickly calculating the work involved. 47 pages of dense legal German would take at least 12 hours to translate properly. These are complex documents, Mr. Donnelly. A quality translation will require more time to ensure accuracy. Then I suggest you work late, Donnelly replied with a cold smile. Unless you're not actually capable of the work you were hired to do? It was a trap, and they both knew it. Rush the translation and she'd produce substandard work he could criticize. Refuse the timeline and she'd be accused of incompetence. Irene met his eyes steadily, recognizing the game for what it was. I'll have them ready, she said simply. She stayed until midnight that night, working through the contracts with meticulous care. Her German was more than adequate. It was native-level fluency honed through years of deployment and specialized training in document analysis. By 11:47, she'd completed a translation that was not only accurate but included annotations where the German legal terminology didn't translate cleanly into English. She sent the completed work to Donnelly's email and finally headed home through Frankfurt's empty streets. The next morning, she found a terse email. Translation adequate. Next time, include fewer unnecessary annotations. They clutter the document. Petra witnessed the exchange and shook her head in disgust. He's never going to give you credit for anything, you know. You could solve world peace, and he'd complain about your font choice. I'm not doing it for credit, Irene replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was doing it for anymore. Pride, perhaps. Or stubbornness. Or the simple refusal to let Donnelly win by forcing her to quit. The pattern continued: impossible tasks completed. Excellent work dismissed. Subtle undermining that never quite justified another HR complaint. Irene endured because endurance was something she knew how to do. She'd survived selection courses designed to break candidates physically and psychologically. She'd operated in hostile territory where one mistake meant death. Compared to that, Donnelly was merely annoying. But on Friday of her 6th week at the firm, something shifted. Irene was at her desk reviewing shipping manifests for a trade law case when she heard raised voices from the conference room. The door was partially open, and through the gap, she could see Donnelly with a young associate named Emma, a first-year lawyer barely older than 25. Donnelly's face was flushed with anger, and his voice carried clearly across the office. This brief is garbage. Absolutely worthless. Did you even read the case law I cited? Or did you just copy and paste whatever you found on Google? Emma's voice was quieter, harder to hear, but Irene caught fragments. Followed your outline exactly. Researched every precedent. Don't make excuses, Donnelly snapped. You're a lawyer at this firm, which means you're supposed to be smart enough to think independently. Apparently, that was an incorrect assumption. Irene saw Emma's shoulders start to shake and recognized the signs of someone fighting tears. Other staff members had noticed too. But they all carefully avoided looking toward the conference room, the standard response to Donnelly's outbursts. Don't get involved. Don't make yourself a target. Let it pass. Irene found herself standing before she'd consciously decided to move. She walked to the conference room and knocked firmly on the doorframe, interrupting Donnelly mid-sentence. Mr. Donnelly, you have a call from Klaus Hoffmann in Stuttgart. He says it's urgent regarding the Bauer merger. It was a complete fabrication. Klaus hadn't called, but Irene delivered the lie with such calm confidence that Donnelly couldn't immediately challenge it without looking foolish. He glared at her, clearly aware he was being managed but uncertain how to respond. Take a message. I'm in a meeting. He specifically requested to speak with you directly, Irene pressed. He said the German Regulatory Board has questions that need immediate answers. The mention of regulatory issues got Donnelly's attention. He turned back to Emma with a dismissive wave. We'll continue this later. Fix the brief and have it on my desk by Monday. Then he stalked past Irene toward his office, muttering about incompetent associates and international complications. Emma emerged from the conference room looking shaken, her eyes red but dry. She gave Irene a grateful look but said nothing, quickly gathering her materials and retreating to her office. Irene returned to her desk, aware that she'd just painted an even larger target on her back. Donnelly would eventually discover there was no urgent call from Stuttgart, and he'd know exactly who'd fabricated the interruption. The reckoning came within the hour. Donnelly appeared at her desk with an expression of barely contained fury. There was no call from Stuttgart. No, sir. Irene replied calmly. There wasn't. You lied to me. You interrupted a private meeting with a fabricated emergency. I did. The admission seemed to throw Donnelly off balance. He'd clearly expected denial or excuses, not straightforward acknowledgement. You realize this is a terminable offense? Lying to a senior partner? I'm aware, Irene said. But watching you berate a young associate to the point of tears seemed like a situation that required intervention. That's not your decision to make. What happens in attorney meetings is none of your concern. Human decency is everyone's concern, Mr. Donnelly. They were drawing attention now, nearby staff members pretending to work while obviously listening. Donnelly lowered his voice, but the anger remained. You think you're some kind of crusader, don't you? Standing up for the weak, challenging authority. Let me tell you something, Hill. In the real world, people like you don't last. You burn bright and fast, and then you're gone, replaced by someone who understands how things actually work. Perhaps, Irene replied. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. Clean out your desk. You're done here. The words fell like stones into water, heavy, final, irreversible. Around them, the office had gone completely silent. Even the phones seemed to have stopped ringing. Irene felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. She'd been fired for doing the right thing, which was somehow better than quitting out of exhaustion or enduring indefinitely out of fear. I'll need that in writing, she said calmly. For unemployment purpose. Donnelly's jaw clenched. You'll have it within the hour. Now get out of my sight. Irene began methodically clearing her desk personal items into her bag, work materials organized for whoever would replace her. She was aware of Petra crying quietly at her desk, of Thomas standing in his office doorway looking stricken, of other colleagues who'd appreciated her quiet competence now watching her professional execution. She was placing her stapler in a box when Emma appeared, her face pale but determined. Mr. Donnelly, I'd like to speak with you about what just happened. Not now, Emma. I've had enough insubordination for one day. It's not insubordination, Emma said, her voice steadier than before. It's a statement of fact. Miss Hill intervened because you were verbally abusing me. If she's being fired for that, then I'll be filing a formal complaint with the managing partners about your conduct. Donnelly turned toward her slowly. You want to file a complaint? Go ahead. I've survived complaints before. You, on the other hand, are a first-year associate who can be let go for any reason during your probationary period. Think carefully about whether this is the hill you want to die on. Actually, came a new voice. I think we need to discuss what hills are worth dying on. Irene looked up to see Gerhard Hartwell himself, managing partner, a name on the door, approaching from the elevator bank. He was in his 70s, tall and distinguished, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. The office atmosphere shifted immediately, people straightening in their chairs, conversations dying mid-sentence. Gerhard, Donnelly said, his tone suddenly careful. This is just a personnel matter. Nothing that requires... I heard raised voices from 2 floors up, Lawrence. That seems to require my attention. Hartwell looked around the office, taking in the frozen tableau, Irene with her box of belongings, Emma standing defensively, Donnelly radiating anger, staff members caught between curiosity and fear. My office. All 3 of you. Now. The walk to Hartwell's office felt surreal. Irene carried her box of personal items, uncertain whether she was about to be fired more officially or given some unexpected reprieve. Emma walked beside her, nervous but resolute. Donnelly followed behind, his earlier confidence visibly shaken by the managing partner's intervention. Hartwell's office occupied the entire northeast corner of the top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Frankfurt's skyline. The space was elegant but not ostentatious, antique furniture mixed with modern technology, walls lined with law books and photographs from 50 years of practice. "Sit," Hartwell commanded, gesturing to chairs arranged before his massive desk. They obeyed silently. He remained standing, hands clasped behind his back, studying each of them in turn. "I'm going to ask a simple question," he began, "and I expect honest answers. What happened down there?" Donnelly spoke first, his voice measured and professional, in a way it never was with support staff. "Gerhard, this is really just a matter of insubordination. Miss Hill has been problematic since she started questioning instructions, overstepping her role, and today she outright lied to interrupt a private meeting. I was simply enforcing workplace standards by terminating her employment. Is that your understanding of events, Miss Hill?" Hartwell asked, turning his sharp gaze toward Irene. Irene set her box down beside her chair and met Hartwell's eyes directly. Mr. Donnelly was berating Emma in the conference room. She was visibly upset, and the situation seemed to be escalating. I fabricated an urgent call to give her an exit from the situation. When Mr. Donnelly discovered the lie, he fired me. "And you, Emma?" Emma took a breath. "Mr. Donnelly has been verbally abusive since I started here 3 months ago. Today was particularly bad. He called my work garbage, questioned my intelligence, and humiliated me in front of colleagues. Miss Hill's intervention was the only reason I didn't break down completely." "That's an exaggeration," Donnelly interjected. "I was providing critical feedback on substandard work. If Emma can't handle honest assessment doesn't require cruelty, Lawrence." Hartwell's voice was quiet but carried weight. "I've been hearing concerns about your management style for some time. I've dismissed them because you're an excellent attorney and you bring significant revenue to this firm. But excellent lawyers who create toxic environments are liabilities, not assets." Donnelly's face darkened. "Gerhard, I've been with this firm for 22 years. I've won cases that built this practice's reputation. If you're seriously considering the complaints of a file clerk and a first-year associate over, I'm considering the pattern," Hartwell interrupted. 7 support staff departures in 3 years, all citing your behavior. Multiple associates requesting transfers away from your cases. A culture of fear that has people crying in conference rooms and lying to protect each other from your temper. He paused, letting the words settle. "That's not the firm I built, Lawrence." The room fell silent. Irene watched the power dynamic shift in real time. Donnelly's confident aggression replaced by something resembling concern. Emma's fear giving way to cautious hope. Hartwell moved to his desk and sat down, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Hill, I reviewed your file before this meeting. Your work has been exemplary. The Stuttgart office specifically requested you for ongoing translation work. Your technical skills exceed your job description." He leaned forward slightly. "But I'm curious about something. Your resume is remarkably vague about your background before joining us. Government administrative work could mean anything from filing papers at a municipal office to considerably more interesting positions." Irene felt her pulse quicken. This was the question she'd been avoiding since her interview, the gap in her story that careful people would eventually notice. "I worked in positions that required discretion, Mr. Hartwell. The specifics are sensitive." "Sensitive how?" "Classified sensitive." Hartwell's eyebrows rose slightly. He glanced at Emma, then back to Irene. "Military?" There was no point in denying it now. "Yes, sir." "What branch?" "Army. Special operations." The words hung in the air. Emma's eyes widened. Donnelly looked confused, as if trying to reconcile the small blonde woman before him with the implications of special operations. Hartwell studied Irene with renewed interest. "Special operations," he repeated. "That's deliberately vague as well. Rangers? Psychological operations?" Irene hesitated, then made a decision. She raised her right hand, letting the silver ring catch the office lighting. "Delta Force, sir." The silence that followed was profound. Emma looked stunned. Donnelly's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment. Hartwell leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Delta Force doesn't officially exist, he said carefully. No, sir, it doesn't, Irene agreed. And women weren't admitted to special operations units until relatively recently. The timeline varies depending on the unit and the roles, sir. Some barriers fell earlier than others for those with specific skill sets. Hartwell nodded slowly. Languages. Cultural expertise. You weren't just operations, you were specialized intelligence and liaison work. Irene didn't confirm or deny, but her silence was answer enough. Hartwell turned his attention to Donnelly, who was still processing the revelation. Lawrence, you've been bullying someone who survived Delta Force selection. Do you have any idea how statistically improbable that is? The selection process has a 90% attrition rate. This woman endured training that would have broken most of the attorneys in this building, then conducted operations in hostile territory that we'll never hear about. And you thought intimidation would work on her? Donnelly opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. She's a file clerk. How was I supposed to know? You weren't supposed to know, Hartwell interrupted. You were supposed to treat her with basic human dignity, regardless of her background. That's the standard for everyone, not just people with impressive military records. Hartwell stood and walked to his windows, looking out over Frankfurt's skyline. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city, highlighting the mix of historic architecture and modern glass towers. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone making a significant decision. Here's what's going to happen. Miss Hill, you're not fired. In fact, you're being reassigned. We have a new position opening in our international liaison department, someone who can handle complex translations, manage relationships with our European offices, and bring organizational skills to a growing division. The position comes with a substantial raise and an office rather than a desk in the clerical pool. Irene blinked, certain she'd misheard. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not qualified for. You're overqualified, Hartwell corrected. Someone who can navigate hostile territory and coordinate complex operations can certainly handle international business relationships. You speak what? 4 languages fluently? 5. Actually. German, English, French, Polish, and Arabic. There you have it. Hartwell turned back to face the room. Emma, you're being reassigned as well. You'll work directly with me on select cases. I need an associate who has the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's professionally dangerous. That's rare and valuable. Emma looked like she might cry from relief. Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. I won't let you down. I know you won't. Hartwell's gaze shifted to Donnelly. Lawrence, you're being placed on administrative review. For the next 6 months, you'll work with an executive coach on management and interpersonal skills. Any complaints during that period will result in a formal partnership review. Is that understood? Donnelly's face had gone through several shades of red during this speech, finally settling on a dangerous crimson. You're punishing me for maintaining standards? For expecting excellence from my staff? I'm holding you accountable for creating a hostile work environment, Hartwell replied calmly. There's a difference between expecting excellence and terrorizing people. You're brilliant in the courtroom, Lawrence, but brilliance doesn't excuse cruelty. Learn that lesson. Or find another firm. The ultimatum hung in the air, final and uncompromising. Donnelly stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I've given this firm 22 years. 22 years of winning cases. Bringing in clients. Building our reputation. And you're going to humiliate me because some file clerk, former special operations soldier, Hartwell corrected quietly. Get the terminology right if you're going to be angry about it. Donnelly's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then he turned and walked out without another word, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the office, followed by uncomfortable silence. Hartwell sighed and returned to his desk. That went about as well as expected. Miss Hill, I apologize for what you've endured here. This firm should have addressed Lawrence's behavior years ago. We allowed revenue generation to excuse inexcusable conduct. Thank you, sir, Irene said, still processing the sudden reversal of her circumstances. But I should clarify, I didn't intend to use my military background as leverage. I was just trying to do my job. I understand that. But your background explains something I've been curious about since reading your file. Most people in your situation would have quit by now, or filed complaints, or found some way to avoid Donnelly altogether. Instead, you stood your ground, maintained your standards, and protected others when they needed it. That's not typical file clerk behavior. That's leadership. I'm not sure I'm leadership material in a corporate environment, sir. The military and corporate law are very different worlds. They're less different than you think, Hartwell replied. Both require discipline, strategic thinking, and the ability to accomplish objectives despite obstacles. The main difference is that corporate law has better coffee and fewer people shooting at you. Emma laughed at that, breaking some of the tension. Irene found herself smiling despite everything. Take the weekend to think about the liaison position, Hartwell continued. If you decide it's not for you, I'll understand. But I think you'd be excellent at it. And frankly, this firm needs more people who aren't afraid to challenge toxic behavior. He paused, looking at the ring on Irene's finger. May I ask, did you ever consider staying in the service? Every day, Irene admitted. But deployment cycles were taking their toll. I wanted a life that didn't require leaving on classified missions with uncertain return dates. I wanted normal. And how's normal working out? Irene thought about the past 6 weeks, the frustration, the diminishment, the constant struggle between who she was and who she was trying to become. It's harder than combat in some ways. At least in combat, the objectives are clear and the rules make sense. Hartwell nodded. The civilian world can be disorienting for people leaving military service, especially when that service was as demanding as yours. But here's what I've learned in 50 years of practice. The skills that make someone excellent in extreme circumstances don't disappear in normal ones. They just need to be adapted. He stood, signaling the meeting's end. Think about the position. Talk to Fisher and HR about the details. And Miss Hill, welcome to the part of this firm that actually values what you bring to the table. The weekend passed in a blur of reflection and decision-making. Irene sat in her sparse apartment, the job offer from Hartwell weighing on her mind like a tactical problem requiring careful analysis. The international liaison position represented everything she'd told herself she wanted: stability, recognition, a role that utilized her actual skills. But it also meant committing more fully to civilian life, to this world of corporate politics and office hierarchies that still felt fundamentally foreign. On Saturday morning, she went for a run along the main river, her pace steady and meditative. The physical exertion helped clear her mind, brought back the clarity she'd always found in movement and discipline. Other runners passed her, weekend athletes in expensive gear, casually jogging at speeds that would have gotten them dropped from selection. She wasn't bitter about it, just observant. Different worlds, different standards. By Sunday evening, she'd made her decision. She'd accept the position, not because corporate law had suddenly become her passion, but because walking away now would mean Donnelly had won. And more importantly, because Hartwell was right, her skills did translate, even if the application looked different. Coordinating international business relationships wasn't so different from coordinating multinational operations. Both required cultural awareness, clear communication, and the ability to navigate complex human dynamics. Monday morning, she arrived at the office early as always. But this time she went directly to Fisher's office rather than to her desk in the clerical pool. The HR director looked up with an expression of satisfaction that suggested she'd been expecting this visit. "You're taking the position," Fisher said. "It wasn't a question. I am," Irene confirmed. "Though I'd like to negotiate one condition." Fisher's eyebrows rose with interest. "Go ahead. I want Petra promoted to senior clerk and given a raise. She's been covering for incompetent colleagues and managing complex workflows without any recognition. If I'm moving up, she deserves to as well." Fisher smiled. "Already approved." Hartwell mentioned you'd probably advocate for someone on your way out of clerical. Petra starts her new role today. She slid a folder across the desk. Your employment contract. Review it. Ask any questions. And if everything looks acceptable, you can start in your new position immediately. Your office is on the 4th floor, next to the international department. Irene reviewed the contract carefully, salary nearly double what she'd been making. Benefits package. Travel expectations for European office visits. Everything seemed straightforward and fair. She signed without hesitation. One more thing, Fisher said as Irene stood to leave. Donnelly submitted his resignation this morning. Effective immediately. Irene stopped, surprised. He quit? The partnership was prepared to work with him through the review process. But apparently, the prospect of answering to an executive coach was too much for his ego. He's joining a smaller firm where he can continue being himself without consequence. Fisher's expression suggested she had opinions about that decision. Between you and me, it's the best outcome for everyone. He gets to maintain his self-image. And we get a healthier work environment. What about his cases? Being distributed among other partners. Emma will continue on several of them, working directly with Hartwell. She's talented, just needed someone who wouldn't destroy her confidence. Fisher stood and extended her hand. Welcome to your new position, Miss Hill. I think you're going to do excellent things here. The 4th floor office was small but private, with a window overlooking the city and enough space for a proper desk, filing cabinets, and a small meeting table. Irene stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. Her nameplate was already on the door. Irene Hill, International Liaison Coordinator. Thomas appeared in the hallway, carrying a small potted plant. Congratulations. Heard you're moving up in the world. Thought your new office could use some life. Thank you, Irene said, accepting the plant, a small succulent that looked nearly as uncomfortable in an office as she felt. I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing yet. None of us are. Thomas replied cheerfully. But you'll figure it out. You always do. Plus, now you have an office door you can close when you need to tell people they're being idiots. That's basically the dream. Over the next several hours, Irene received visits from colleagues, some offering congratulations, others curiosity about her background, a few clearly hoping to understand how a file clerk had suddenly become management level. She answered questions carefully, revealing nothing classified while still acknowledging the broad strokes of her military service. Petra appeared just before lunch, her eyes red but her smile genuine. Senior clerk. Can you believe it? After 3 years of doing everyone else's work, someone finally noticed. You earned it, Irene said. Probably earned it years ago, because of you. You stood up to Donnelly, and somehow that changed everything. Petra paused at the doorway. Thank you for showing us that bullies can be beaten. After Petra left, Irene sat at her new desk and pulled up her email. The inbox was already filling with messages, introductions from European offices, requests for translation assistance, meeting invitations. The work was different from clerical duties, but the underlying principle remained the same. Pay attention to details. Communicate clearly. Solve problems before they escalate. She could do this. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Heard about your promotion. Congratulations. You deserve better treatment from the start. Emma. Irene smiled and typed a reply. We both did. Looking forward to working with you properly. 3 months into her new role, Irene found herself in Stuttgart for a week-long series of meetings with the German office. The work was challenging but satisfying, negotiating contract terms, coordinating multi-jurisdictional cases, building relationships with international colleagues who valued her cultural expertise and language skills. For the first time since leaving the service, she felt like herself capable, respected, operating at the level her training had prepared her for. On her last evening in Stuttgart, Klaus Hoffmann invited her to dinner at a traditional Swabian restaurant near the city center. They discussed upcoming cases and potential expansions of the firm's European operations, but eventually the conversation turned more personal. I was curious when you first started answering my calls. Klaus admitted over schnitzel and local wine. Your German was too perfect for someone in a clerical position, native fluency, with technical vocabulary that suggested specialized training. I wondered what your story was. And now that you know, now I understand why Hartwell promoted you so quickly. You're not just competent, you're operating several levels above what your position required. The question is, are you happy? Or are you still trying to figure out where you fit? Irene considered the question carefully. I'm happier than I was 3 months ago. Whether that's the same as fitting in, I'm not sure yet. Corporate law still feels like a foreign culture sometimes. Most meaningful work feels foreign at first, Klaus replied. The key is finding the aspects that align with who you are rather than trying to become someone different. He paused. Can I ask, do you miss the military? Every day, Irene said honestly. But I don't regret leaving. I needed a life that didn't require carrying weapons and watching for threats constantly. I needed to prove I could succeed in a normal environment. And have you proven that? Irene thought about the past 3 months, the challenges navigated, the relationships built, the small victories of solving complex problems without violence or threat. She thought about Donnelly's departure and the culture shift it had created, about Emma's growing confidence, about Petra's promotion. Change hadn't come because she'd been exceptional. It had come because she'd refused to accept unacceptable behavior. I'm working on it, she said finally. The following week, back in Frankfurt, Irene received an unexpected visitor. Gerhard Hartwell appeared at her office door with a folder and an expression that suggested significant news. Do you have a moment? He asked. Of course, sir. Hartwell settled into one of her office chairs with the ease of someone comfortable in any setting. I've been reviewing the performance metrics from our European offices. Since you took over international liaison work, communication efficiency has improved by 40%. Contract negotiation timelines have shortened, and client satisfaction scores are the highest they've been in 5 years. The European teams are excellent to work with, Irene said. I'm just facilitating better connection. You're doing considerably more than that, but I appreciate the modesty. Hartwell opened the folder, revealing organizational charts and financial projections. I'm proposing a new position, Director of International Operations. You'd oversee all European coordination, manage a small team, and work directly with partnership on strategic expansion. It's a significant increase in responsibility and compensation. Irene looked at the proposal, genuinely surprised. Sir, I've been in this role for 3 months. Isn't this moving rather quickly? Normally, yes. But you're not a normal case. You've demonstrated leadership, cultural expertise, and the ability to transform organizational culture. Those skills are rare and valuable. Hartwell leaned forward. I learned something important from the Donnelly situation. Talent often comes in unexpected packages, and if we're too rigid about traditional career paths, we miss opportunities to utilize that talent effectively. You've proven yourself not just in the military, but here, in this environment, under difficult circumstances. I appreciate your confidence, sir. May I have time to consider the offer? Take a week. Talk to Fisher about the details. Think about what you want your career to look like. Hartwell stood to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing. That ring you wear, the one that revealed your background. It represents something important, doesn't it? It represents earning a place through capability rather than circumstance. Irene replied, proving that assumptions about limitations are often wrong. Keep wearing it, Hartwell said. This firm needs reminders that excellence comes in many forms, and that underestimating people based on appearance or background is a costly mistake. After Hartwell left, Irene sat alone in her office, absently turning the silver ring on her finger. The symbols etched into its surface caught the afternoon light marks that represented a community of people who'd proven themselves against impossible odds, who'd refused to accept limitations others tried to impose. She'd spent months trying to hide that part of herself, to become someone who fit comfortably into corporate law's polished world. But maybe the lesson wasn't about fitting in. Maybe it was about bringing her authentic self to whatever environment she inhabited, about maintaining the standards and values that made her who she was, regardless of the setting. Her phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Coffee tomorrow? Want to hear about the director position? The whole office is talking about it." Irene smiled and typed her reply. "Tomorrow works. Fair warning, I'm still deciding." "You'll take it," Emma responded immediately. "Because you're not someone who backs away from challenges." She was right, of course. Irene had never backed away from challenges, not in selection, not in operations, not when facing Donnelly's intimidation. She'd simply needed time to understand that corporate battles required different tactics than military ones. But the underlying principles remained the same. Maintain your standards. Protect those who need it. Refuse to accept that impossible is permanent. The ring on her finger had once represented a world of classified operations and extreme challenges. Now it represented something equally important, a reminder that strength came in many forms, that size and appearance meant nothing compared to determination and skill, and that the most satisfying victories were the ones where you stayed true to yourself while proving others wrong. Irene opened her laptop and began drafting an email to Hartwell. She'd accept the director position, not because she'd figured out how to fit into corporate law, but because she'd figured out how to bring her authentic self to it. The Delta Force ring stayed on her finger, visible to anyone who cared to notice. Some people would always underestimate her. That was their problem, not hers. She hit send on the email and looked out her office window at Frankfurt's skyline, at the city where she'd started this chapter of her life feeling invisible and undervalued. 3 months had changed everything, not because the world had suddenly recognized her worth, but because she'd refused to diminish herself to make others comfortable. The civilian world was still foreign territory in many ways. But foreign territory was something Irene Hill knew how to navigate. She'd done it in 17 countries under considerably more dangerous circumstances. Corporate law, comparatively, was manageable. As the sun set over the Rhine River, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Irene began planning for her new role. There was work to do, teams to build, strategies to develop. The challenge ahead looked different from those she'd faced before, but the core remained the same: lead with competence, treat people with dignity, and never accept that limitations others impose are permanent. She'd tried to intimidate the new clerk. Then he saw her Delta Force ring, and everything changed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.